Yes, let's read some more before the late evening news in 50 minutes.
Composition of the Torah. The composition of the Torah, or Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, was a process that involved multiple authors over an extended period of time. 1. While Jewish tradition holds that all 5 books were originally written by Moses in the 2nd millennium BCE, leading scholars have rejected Mosaic authorship since the 17th century. 2. The precise process by which the Torah was composed, the number of authors involved, and the date of each author remain hotly contested among scholars. 3. Some scholars, such as Rolf Rentef, espouse a fragmentary hypothesis, in which the Pentateuch is seen as a compilation of short, independent narratives which were gradually brought together into larger units in 2 editorial phases, the Deuteronomic and the priestly phases. 4, 5, 6. By contrast, scholars such as John Van Setters advocate a supplementary hypothesis which posits that the Torah is the result of 2 major additions, Yahwist and priestly, to an existing corpus of work. 7. Other scholars, such as Richard Elliott Friedman or Joel S. Baden, support a revised version of the documentary hypothesis, holding that the Torah was composed by using 4 different sources: Yahwist, Elohist, priestly and Deuteronomist, that were combined into one in the Persian period. 8, 9, 10. Scholars frequently use these newer hypotheses in combination with each other, making it difficult to classify contemporary theories as strictly one or another. 11. The general trend in recent scholarship is to recognize the final form of the Torah as a literary and ideological unity, based on earlier sources, likely completed during the Persian period, 539 to 333 BCE. 12, 13, 14. Date of composition. Classical source criticism seeks to determine the date of a text by establishing an upper limit, terminus ante, and a lower limit, terminus post-cum, on the basis of external attestation of the text's existence, as well as the internal features of the text itself. 15. On the basis of a variety of arguments, modern scholars generally see the completed Torah as a product of the time of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, probably 450–350 BCE. 12, 13. Although some would place its composition in the Hellenistic period, 333–164 BCE. 16. External evidence. The absence of archaeological evidence for the Exodus narrative, and the evidence pointing to anachronisms in the patriarchal narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, 17, have convinced the vast majority of scholars that the Torah does not give an accurate account of the origins of Israel. 18, 19. This implies that the Torah could not have been written by Moses during the 2nd millennium BCE, as Jewish tradition teaches. Manuscripts and non-biblical references. Concrete archaeological evidence bearing on the dating of the Torah is found in early manuscript fragments such as those found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The earliest extant manuscript fragments of the Pentateuch date to the late 3rd or early 2nd centuries BCE. 20, 21. In addition, early non-biblical sources, such as the letter of Aristes, indicate that the Torah was first translated into Greek in Alexandria under the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, 285-247 BCE. These lines of evidence indicate that the Torah must have been composed in its final form no later than c. 250 BCE, before its translation into Greek. 22-23. There is one external reference to the Torah which, depending on its attribution, may push the terminus antiquum for the composition of the Torah down to about 315 BCE. In Book 40 of Diodorus Siculus's library, an ancient encyclopedia compiled from a variety of quotations from older documents, there is a passage that refers to a written Jewish law passed down from Moses. 24. Scholars have traditionally attributed the passage to the late 4th century Greek historian Hecataeus of Abdera, which, if correct, would imply that the Torah must have been composed in some form before 315 BCE. However, the attribution of this passage to Hecataeus has been challenged recently. Russell Merkin has argued that the passage is in fact a quote from Theophanes of Mytilene, a 1st century BCE Roman biographer cited earlier in Book 40, who in turn used Hecataeus along with other sources. 25. Elephantine Papyri. A letter from the Elephantine Papyri requesting the rebuilding of a Jewish temple at Elephantine. The Elephantine Papyri show clear evidence of the existence c. 400 BCE of a polytheistic Jewish colony in Egypt who show no knowledge of a written Torah or the narratives describe it. 26-27. The papyri also document the existence of a small Jewish temple at Elephantine, which possessed altars for incense offerings and animal sacrifices, as late as 411 BCE. Such a temple would be in clear violation of Deuteronomic law, which stipulates that no Jewish temple may be constructed outside of Jerusalem. 28. Furthermore, the papyri show that the Jews at Elephantine sent letters to the high priest in Jerusalem asking for his support in rebuilding their temple, which seems to suggest that the priests of the Jerusalem temple were not enforcing Deuteronomic law at that time. 29. A minority of scholars such as Niels Peter Lemch, Philippe Wajdenborn, Russell Merkin, and Thomas L. Thompson have argued that the Elephantine papyri demonstrate that monotheism and the Torah could not have been established in Jewish culture before 400 BCE, and that the Torah was therefore likely written in the Hellenistic period, in the 3rd or 4th centuries BCE. See possibility of a Hellenistic origin. 30. By contrast, most scholars explain this data by theorizing that the Elephantine Jews represented an isolated remnant of Jewish religious practices from earlier centuries. 27. Or that the Torah had only recently been promulgated at that time. 31. Kitv scrolls. In 1979, 2 silver scrolls were uncovered at Kitv, an archaeological site southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, which were found to contain a variation of the priestly blessing, found in Numbers 6:24-26. The scrolls were dated paleographically to the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, placing them at the end of the first. The 2 scrolls on display temple period. 32. These scrolls cannot be accepted as evidence that the Pentateuch as a whole was composed before the 6th century, however, because it is widely accepted that the Torah draws on earlier oral and written sources, and there is no reference to a written Torah in the scrolls themselves. 33. Linguistic dating. Some scholars, such as A.V. Ihovitz, see date of the priest Lysis below, have attempted to date the various strata of the Pentateuch on the basis of the form of the Hebrew language that is used. It is generally agreed that Classical Hebrew and Late Biblical Hebrew had distinctive, identifiable features and that Classical Hebrew was earlier. Classical Hebrew is usually dated to the period before the Babylonian captivity, 597-539 BCE, while Late Biblical Hebrew is generally dated to the exilic and post-exilic periods. However, it is difficult to determine precisely when classical Hebrew ceased being used, since there are no extant Hebrew inscriptions of substantial ink dating from the relevant period, c. 550–200 BCE. 34, 35. Scholars also disagree about the variety of Hebrew to which the various strata should be assigned. For example, Hovitz classifies the priestly material as belonging to classical Hebrew. 36, 34, while Joseph Blenkinsop and most other scholars disagree. 37, 38. Another methodological difficulty with linguistic dating is that it is known that the biblical authors often intentionally used archaisms for stylistic effects, sometimes mixing them with words and constructions from later periods. This means that the presence of archaic language in a text cannot be considered definitive proof that the text dates to an early period. 39. Ian Young and Martin Ahrensvard maintain that even some texts that were certainly written during the post-exilic period, such as the Book of Haggai, lack features distinctive of late biblical Hebrew. 35. Conversely, the Book of Ezekiel, written during the Babylonian exile, contains many features of late biblical Hebrew. 40. Summing up these problems, Young has argued none of the linguistic criteria used to date biblical texts either early or late is strong enough to compel scholars to reconsider an argument made on non-linguistic grounds. 41. However, this position has been rejected by other scholars, such as Ronald Hendel and Jan Joosten, who criticize that Young and others exclusively use the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible to carry out their linguistic analysis of the biblical texts, apart from undertaking other errors in the fields of textual criticism and historical linguistics. 42. For their part, Ronald Hendel and Jan Joosten hold that the Hebrew contained in the Genesis 2 Kings saga corresponds to the classical Hebrew of the pre-exilic period. 43, which is supported by the linguistic correspondence with the Hebrew inscriptions of that period, mainly from the 8th and 7th centuries BC, so that they consequently date the composition of the main sources of the Torah to the period of Neo-Assyrian hegemony. 44. Historiographical dating. Many scholars assign dates to the Pentateuchal sources by comparing the theology and priorities of each author to a theoretical reconstruction of the history of Israelite religion. This method often involves provisionally accepting some narrative in the Hebrew Bible as attesting to a real historical event, and situating the composition of a source relative to that event. 45. For example, the Deuteronomist source is widely associated with the staunchly monotheistic, centralizing religious reforms of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, as described in 2 Kings. Starting with Julius Wellhausen, many scholars have identified the Book of the Law discovered by Josiah's high priest Hilkiah in 2 Kings 22:23 with Book of Deuteronomy, or an early version thereof, and posited that it was in fact written by Hilkiah at that time. 46. Authors such as John Van Setters therefore date the D source to the late 7th century. 47. Similarly, many scholars associate the priestly source with the Book of the Law brought to Israel by Ezra upon his return from exile in Babylonia in 458 BCE, as described in Nehemiah 8:10. He is therefore widely dated to the 5th century during the Persian period. 46. This method has been criticized by some scholars, however, especially those associated with the minimalist school of biblical criticism. These critics stress that the historicity of the Josiah and Ezra narratives cannot be independently established outside the Hebrew Bible, and that archaeological evidence generally does not support the occurrence of a radical centralizing religious reform in the 7th century as described in 2 Kings. 48. They conclude that dating Pentateuchal sources on the basis of historically dubious or uncertain evidence is inherently speculative and inadvisable. 49. Arguments for a Persian origin. In the influential book In Search of Ancient Israel, a study in biblical origins, Philip Davies argued that Torah was likely promulgated in its final form during the Persian period, when the Judean people were governed under the Yad Medinata province of the Achaemenid Empire. 50-51. Davies points out that the Persian Empire had a general policy of establishing national law codes and consciously creating an ethnic identity among its conquered peoples in order to legitimate its rule.